కరోనా టీకా తయారీలో రంగంలో నిపుణులు అనుభవజ్ఞులతో కేటీఆర్ ముచ్చటిస్తున్నారు. కార్యక్రమాన్ని ప్రత్యక్ష ప్రసారం ద్వారా చూద్దాం.
Entering phase 3 trials. So we will know in the next few months about the safety and efficacy of these vaccines. And I emphasize safety as very important because to get public trust, when you are going to vaccinate huge numbers of healthy individuals, the safety bar of the vaccine has to be set quite high in order for it to be acceptable and usable in the population. So things like the disease enhancement, which is something which has happened previously with other vaccines, and other rare side effects that you notice only when tens of thousands of people have been vaccinated, those have to be really followed up. So one of the things we need to prepare for is a pharmacovigilance strategies and mechanisms, not just during the clinical trial, but after licensure and after it starts getting used widely. We need to keep an eye for the next couple of years on the safety profile of this vaccine. Efficacy, of course, is important, and the WHO has already put out guidance on what we consider as acceptable efficacy. So it would be good to have a vaccine with at least 70% efficacy, minimum of 50%, but with a lower bound of efficacy not falling below 30%. Because modeling has shown that anything below 50% efficacious vaccine is not going to have much of a public health impact. So that's the kind of a benchmark that we hope for. Now, through the ACT accelerator that WHO launched on April 24th with many partners, what we are hoping to do is to speed up the R&D for vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, but also ensure equitable access. So it's not just a question of faster development, but also of fair and equitable access to populations around the world. We do not want to be in a situation which happened as during the H1N1 pandemic 2009-10, when a few rich countries bought most of the supplies and stocks of vaccines and only started donating it to the lower income countries when they realized that infection probably wasn't as serious or severe as it was supposed to be, and they had excess stocks. Now, if that happens again this time, then I think all of us would have failed. What we hope to do is to, as vaccines become available, to distribute them across the world to protect those who are the most vulnerable, the frontline workers, the health workers, the others who are at highest risk of getting infection, then the vulnerable group within the community, and then go to the rest of the population as the stocks become more and more available. So the COVAX initiative, which is WHO, CEPI, and Gavi, aims to have 2 billion doses of the vaccine by end of 2021. A realistic timeline to start getting the first millions of doses would be the first half of 2021. But then will come the distribution, the delivery, and then for countries to be able to start vaccinating their populations. This is something that ministries are already looking at. They are drawing up their policies. They're looking at supply chain and other logistics that will be needed. One of the things we don't know is which vaccine will be successful and what the storage conditions will be. There are a couple of vaccines which need to be stored at -70 or -80. Others, hopefully, at 4 to 8 degrees. So we have to be prepared for those. And we have to get agreement between countries. In the next few weeks, actually, we need to get agreement that they will follow the fair allocation mechanism that's being developed by WHO. Side by side, the COVAX facility is being set up by Gavi. This is a risk pooling mechanism where self-financing countries can put in some funds so that they can procure vaccines for their populations. And they are pooling the risk because the COVAX facility will buy vaccines which are going to be proven to be safe and efficacious. And at the same time, the ODA funds will pay for the vaccines which will go to the Gavi eligible countries. The number of Gavi eligible countries has been increased now to 92. India, of course, is a Gavi eligible country and so should be getting the vaccine doses from the COVAX facility. But India being a hub of manufacturing could also consider how and they are going to really interact with the rest of the world and with the COVAX facility in terms of sharing of the vaccines that are going to be produced in India, and a lot of them are going to be produced in Hyderabad.
Yes, ma'am. In fact,
we are fortunate that Mahima is on the panel. She's on the board for the COVAX facility. There's a coordinating mechanism, and she represents the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturers Association. So we have a strong voice from India on that board as we shape it up and as it moves. As I said, the next few weeks are going to be quite critical. Over to you, Minister.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. In fact, like you pointed out, India continues to remain a hub for vaccine manufacturing. And within India, Telangana and Hyderabad have been, on the forefront. And today, like I pointed out, more than 1/3 of global vaccines are produced from Genome Valley in Hyderabad. So we're very proud, and all the very, very pertinent points you made. Thank you very much. But one quick thing before I turn, quick question before I turn to the panel here, of the industry leaders. Yesterday, I had read a statement from the World Health Organization chief saying that while a vaccine, the hope for a vaccine is very real and it might happen, there is also an equal chance that there could never be a vaccine. Can you help us understand this? Because, vaccine in current situation seems to be a ray of hope, but there must be a reason, there must be a logic. I'm sure the industry here will never, possibly agree with whatever was said, but nevertheless, help us understand why or what would prompt someone to say, like in the case of HIV, how there could never be a vaccine. In case of COVID as well, it was pointed out yesterday that there also is a chance, however fat or slim it is, that there could never be a vaccine. Is that a fair reasoning, fair thought process? What are your thoughts?
So I think the experts who are sitting with you know very well that vaccine development is a risky business and that success is not assured. We have many diseases for which we don't have vaccines, in spite of a lot of R&D having been done over decades, like HIV, TB, malaria, etc. We have so far not had a vaccine for a coronavirus. So this is a new endeavor. So we are optimistic because of the efforts going into it and because of the number of different platforms that are being tested. But we haven't understood the virus completely. And so there is always a possibility that we don't get it right or that it takes longer. We may not get it right the first time. It may take longer. And that is why I think the DG is warning people, do not believe that the problem is going to be solved in 6 months or 12 months.
Taking care of the science behind and ensuring the efficacy of the vaccine is also taken into account before we talk about a full-fledged launch. Help us understand, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Honorable Minister. And we are really proud of Soumya heading the WHO. I think first Indian and first woman candidate heading there. We are proud of you. And I think, the vaccine field takes 14 to 15 years a vaccine to develop. So we are trying to develop in less than 18 months or 12 months in this vaccine. It's complicated. But at the same time, with the vaccine experience, we are also much more cautious. It's not that we are trying to make it a vaccine just to move it fast to the market. No. I think we are putting a lot of intensive research in all 360 degrees, and that is where the partnership is helping us with US, WHO, everybody helping us to look at the critique, some of the scientific aspect of it, so that we don't short-circuit the science. That is not there. So we are much more rigorous today. But problem, as Soumya said, the virus is a new one. So it's like a relationship. You need to build a relationship with the virus to understand how this virus behaves. Besides, the people's genetic makeup also is playing a role. As she said, we don't know whether we all of us had a respiratory pathogen infection. That might be the reason why we have death rate less in this country compared to the Italy or Spain, where the high death rate. So we might have got a lot of other infections before respiratory pathogens. So I think, we are not short-circuiting in any way the science. And I can tell you, our sciences are all critiqued by the global community, not by India alone. It's a global community. So rest assured that any of the Hyderabad company or Indian company will short-circuit on science on this matter. That I can assure them.
Thank you, Krishna. In fact, that's very comforting to hear because, while we are all actively wanting a very, very impactful vaccine coming out ASAP, possibly day after tomorrow or yesterday, in fact, the fact is we cannot afford to short circuit, like you put, the whole science behind vaccine development. Now, let me turn over to Mahima. As Dr. Swaminathan pointed out, you're in a very pivotal role right now, representing the developed countries in Gavi, and also your company biologically has been in vaccine development for more than nearly 5 decades now, and a very, very reputed organization which has known the science. Why don't you walk us through, because again, from a very layman perspective, there are multiple approaches to a vaccine. If there are 150 vaccines that are currently under preparation, etc., what are the different approaches the world is taking? What is the difference between the vaccine that you're currently engaged in vis-a-vis Indian Immunologicals or Covaxin of Bharat or say Serum Institute, etc.? Also talk us through possibly how has vaccine development evolved in the last 5 decades? Because you've been in this business, for the last several decades. So talk us through how scientific developments have helped and possibly how that can be put to good use so that this expeditious delivery that people are anticipating for COVID can be fructified. No, thanks, Mahima. Cheers. Yeah.
I don't know if you can hear me. Okay. So first of all, I think at the heart of it, vaccine development, to put it in really simplistic terms, is really giving your body a bacteria or a virus that's highly purified. So it's basically stimulating what would naturally be the way a disease would be contracted, but in a very controlled fashion, such that it's giving your body the ability and the time to raise antibodies and fight the infection naturally. And the reason it needs to be controlled is because it needs to be safe. You don't want a high viral load and so on. So at the crux of it, all vaccines aim to do what nature does itself. All the people recovering from COVID, they're getting exposed to the virus and they're raising antibodies and they're getting protected. So this is a way of simulating that. So all vaccines aim to do that. If I had to classify vaccines into the categories that, based on the technology platforms, currently I would classify them into 4. And I'm sorry if there's scientists in the audience, there might be 10, but the way I understand it in my head is into 4 buckets. So the first bucket is viral vaccines that are inactivated. These can be whole virions or the virus itself that's inactivated either chemically or through heat or through other mechanisms. And I believe Bharat Biotech's Covaxin follows that approach, as do several others. The second bucket, I would say, is protein vaccines. So these are the spike proteins, which is the spike on the corona, giving it its name. There's the RBD, the receptor binding domain-based proteins, which play a role in inhibiting the virus attaching itself to the ACE2 receptors in our body. So there's a whole host of vaccines that are targeting spike proteins or the RBD. The third bucket, I would say, also targets spike proteins or RBD. So effectively, it's a protein approach, but it's also driven by new vectors, either modified vaccine Ancaria or the AdVac vectors, and so on. And the fourth bucket, I would say, is the other and really novel technologies, which are your DNA vaccines and RNA vaccines, which is basically like a messenger. It's like coding. It's aimed to deliver a code to your genes and to your RNA to start producing antibodies against the virus. And frankly, it's extremely interesting platform technology, extremely exciting. And I think, DNA and RNA vaccines have been in development for close to 15 years now. But this is really an opportune moment to test that technology. But unlike human beings, not all vaccines are created equal, and each of these come with their own sets of challenges in order to develop. Like Dr. Swaminathan pointed out, some of the new DNA and RNA vaccines need to be kept in minus 70 degrees. Now, these are programmatically extremely challenging. But I do want to talk a little bit about, what we're doing to, have an expeditious vaccine. And in many ways, I agree with Dr. Ella that while there's no trade-offs in science, we are collectively making some trade-offs, because in reality, you would expect a vaccine to be over 90% efficacious. But all of vaccine development, not just now, historically has to be viewed in the context of risk. Now, when you had widespread polio, we agreed to take the risk that when you take OPV vaccine, 1 in X percentage get polio because of the vaccine. But that's because the risk of polio was so high. I think COVID is similar. The fact that WHO put out TPP requirements for 50 to 80% efficacy tells you the trade-off that we're willing to make, but never at the cost of safety, because the last thing you want to do is make a situation even worse. Now, coming to our own candidates, we've been working on an RBD protein candidate, and the expression system we're using is yeast. It's Pichia. It's tried and tested. We've made hundreds of million doses of hepatitis B on that platform. And I think much like ourselves, many companies are choosing platforms that they are familiar with, that they have infrastructure for. Because the key to speed is, 150 candidates are not going to be able to make the vaccine in hundreds of millions of doses. And I think that's very key, to marry the technology with the infrastructure and the track record and capability. Now, our choice of RBD was dictated by the infrastructure match that would best allow us to make vaccine as quickly as possible. And so far, we're going to start phase 1 studies in September, but from the manufacturability perspective, we have enough data that assures us that we'll be in a position to produce 80 to 100 million doses a month of this vaccine from the get-go. I think that's crucial, because in the early years, you're going to have a demand-supply gap and allocations. Everybody is going to fight over it. So it's really important to be able to scale quickly. And when we talk about challenges, we could discuss that. But in my mind, the reason it'll be expeditious is because we are making certain trade-offs in context of risk, but not in relation to safety. We may be making trade-offs in terms of the expectation on timing of protection, because we may say, hey, it's okay if it protects us for 1 year, we'll take it yearly as opposed to a lifetime, but really not at the cost of safety. And the second most important factor is having large-scale infrastructure that you can deploy these technologies into. I hope that answers.
No, absolutely. In fact, before we go to scale, before we talk about how, like Dr. Swaminathan pointed out, some countries tend to hoard, then, at the cost of developing nations, etc. Before we go into that, I think one important question that, is currently sort of has been overlooked in the past but has come to the fore now, is how competition, such as you, all three of you, or in fact, other vaccine manufacturers in the country, including Serum and others, in a country like India, where government doesn't spend too much on R&D. Government per se does not spend a lot of money on research and development. Of course, we encourage private sector to invest in R&D. We encourage private sector, of course, to take the risk. And of course, the reward also will be that much higher. The fact is, this is the first time you three are sharing a podium or a platform on a vaccine development, or especially in light of COVID. Let me ask you, Anand, Indian Immunologicals again has a long track record. How do we ensure as a government, be it the Telangana government or be it government of India, how do we ensure that while you actively compete with each other, while you actively race up against each other in development of a vaccine, in pursuit of vaccine, isn't there scope for you to collaborate, work with each other, and also talk to each other, engage with each other, so that when humanity is faced with such a huge crisis, should we not be coming together more often as industry, as government, as competition, to collaborate and to come out with more coherent and synergistic strategies? Your thoughts on this? Then we can go into other things.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for organizing a platform where at least 3 manufacturers who are supposed to be one of the largest in India to come together. As you rightly said, that COVID-19 has offered us a tremendous challenge, especially for all the vaccine manufacturers to come out with a candidate vaccine at a very, very rapid speed. We are, in fact, some of our companies are in talking terms with each other to see if we can combine together to use our facilities. Here actually we don't call this as a rat race or something, because here when humanity is at risk, we are always talking to each other to see that if we can agree on using our combined strength to bring about a vaccine at the fastest pace. In our case, we at Indian Immunologicals, there are various, as Dr. Soumya said, that there are various platforms being pursued. We have chosen a live attenuated codon de-optimized platform. The live attenuated codon de-optimized platform gives tremendous advantage for a country like ours. Especially, this vaccine needs to be administered right from children to senior citizens. So if the vaccine is going to be priced very high, then it's going to be totally unaffordable for any government. Like I heard one of our competitor vaccine companies saying that a vaccine will be priced at 1,000 rupees a dose. 1,000 rupees a dose for a country of our size. And if you want to achieve, let's say even 70%, because 70% is a number which is given to as a number for herd immunity. So if you calculate our population of our size at 1,000 rupees, it's going to be several lakh crores of rupees which will be spent on vaccination, totally not feasible. So we have taken an approach which is a very difficult approach, because in our live attenuated vaccine technology, it will stimulate both humoral immunity and cell-mediated immune response, and probably 1 or 2 doses is sufficient for, we expect that 1 or 2 doses is sufficient for the entire lifespan, and the cost would be not as high as well. So, under normal circumstances, live attenuated vaccines would take several years to develop. If you see, there are very successful live attenuated vaccines like measles vaccine, which is rubella vaccine, which is being used now. But we have modern technology called codon de-optimization. With that, with the help of our collaborators in Australia and in the US, we have almost constructed 20 live attenuated codon de-optimized viruses. We will start the mice studies in September. And then we'll do the non-human primate studies in October. And we are planning to start the phase 1 trials as early as January 2021. So the thing is, our approach takes a little longer because technologically it's much more challenging to do. But then when it comes as a vaccine, then we will be the most cost effective, and it will be a vaccine where you administer once or twice and then you don't have to administer for the rest of the life. So that's the approach that we're taking. And in the meantime, we do have spare capacity. If any of our friends want to utilize some of our fill-finish capacity, they are free to approach us, and we are always happy to share our capacities.
Did you say free to approach, or did you say free to use as well? Thank you, Anand, for that generous offer.
Could I
Krishna?
just make a quick comment on the collaboration?
Please.
I was in discussions with others from the Serum Institute, and we have an association called the Vaccine Manufacturing Association, in which Indian manufacturers are part of that. And in that context, we've been in discussion over several policy issues, and this certainly came up. There's a principal understanding between us that we will deploy capacities for each other. And what's important to understand, it's not just in the context context of COVID, but while we're trying to develop COVID vaccines, we have routine immunization commitments and supply commitments on Rota, on, DPT, Penta. But it's not easy to deploy capacity with each other because of the way the regulatory system is set up. So if father wanted to say that, B, you fill my pentavalent because, I have COVID obligations, for us to do that, we have to potentially go through clinical trials, but it requires full of manufacturers who have the track record to making this happen. So I've gone out on a limb here, but I think funding is a key thing. The second are the regulatory challenges. And it's not in the day-to-day clearances, because I have to say that between DBT and the DCGI, they have been proactive in reaching out and saying, if you don't get clearance in 24 hours, so has the state of Telangana. I get calls. The reverse is happening, so it's actually kind of interesting to be put on the other side of things. So it's not about the day-to-day, but India still hasn't made clear the guidelines for what it means to license a vaccine. What efficacy parameters are you going to use? And FDA and WHO have published those guidelines. I know India is still working on the guidelines, but they haven't been published. This is really important because then you measure every vaccine with the same yardstick and then you ensure safety. So I think we immediately need those guidelines to be put in place because manufacturers have a goal. Is it immunogenicity? Is it fourfold increase? Or do you expect efficacy, like WHO does expect efficacy? And what is that need is not being made clear. And the third challenge, I would say, is really this issue of allocation, which I touched upon. And that issue of allocation is not just a pull mechanism, but it's extremely important in the context of India contributing to the global equity, to global equitable access. And I just want to sign off by saying that from our standpoint, our philosophy has been that we ensure equitable access. For us, all children are created equal, and we want to make sure that the price of the vaccine doesn't come in the way of a country making a decision to adopt the vaccine. We will do everything possible to make sure the country is incentivized to adopt the vaccine. Now, when it comes to institutional challenges, they're more fundamental. We don't have enough clinical trial sites and infrastructure in the country to rapidly deploy 15 different vaccines into different clinical trial cohorts. We don't have access to discovery-related infrastructure. Like right now, to do the non-human primate challenge studies, all of us are standing in line, and that's very hard to access. And the third one is the regulatory framework. I heard someone refer to this in an article calling it the bureaucratic cholesterol. So we need some kind of anticoagulants to unblock that bureaucratic cholesterol in the long term to be very effective.
I've heard many things, but I've never heard bureaucratic cholesterol. That's interesting. I'm going to use this term a bit more now. Thank you. No, not at all. In fact, I think it's some plain speak is sometimes much required than what we would like to believe. Thank you very much for that perspective. And another take home for me is, you said all children are created equal. I think all humans, all children, all of us are created equal. It's just that the access and the affordability piece, I think that is what has been a huge challenge. Now, let's go to Anand. Anand, a lot of times people assume that since you're named Indian Immunologicals, you're actually owned by the government. But I think you should give us a perspective of how your experience has been in dealing with the regulatory framework, the regulatory roadblocks, etc. Tell us what needs to change. Tell us how a state can be your partner in terms of ensuring that your voice is heard in Delhi and action is taken, especially in these testing times.
Thanks a lot. And first, let me start by saying that there has not been one meeting in the country. There are only 7 serious vaccine manufacturers in the country. There's not been one meeting held where all these 7 people have been brought together into one room and try to even understand where we are related to in terms of R&D. And see, the country has a lot of infrastructure built in terms of science, but they're all in silos. You have a lot of academic research institutes across the country, but then you have vaccine manufacturers. There's not been any attempt to bring them all together. In the sense that if this was done, then probably we could, as Mahima said, today even for small testing, we have to send outside the country for testing. But we have within India, we have a lot of research institutes which belong to DBT and CSR, which could come and help us in terms of providing various, in terms of developing any test methods or helping us with some process development issues. So that kind of bringing together all the vaccine manufacturers along with some leading academic institutes would to an extent help us a lot. Next is Mahima touched upon funding. As you said, we don't see any pull mechanism because each of us, as of now, we are just trying to spend from our own pockets, not even knowing like how much of this is going to be taken up later. And so there has to be some kind of a mechanism which would at least help us de-risk in this funding mechanism. The third is the regulatory, which Dr. Ella talked about. True that today, under normal circumstances itself, reaching out to the regulatory authorities is very difficult, and now especially in COVID times, it's not feasible for us to travel to Delhi as frequently as we did. So if some kind of a decentralization of that can happen, especially if some of those authorities can be given to Hyderabad, then that would definitely help us in our development process and also regulatory approval process.
Fantastic. In fact, I heard three words very clearly: decentralize, funding, and be flexible. These are the three messages I think for the government, from the industry. I think these three things, if we can take care of, I think more and more can happen. I don't know if we still have Dr. Swaminathan with us. Is she on, Shakti? Is she still with us? Dr. Swaminathan, I'm not sure if you're with us. If you are, ma'am, I'd like to ask you one quick question. Or before she joins us, in fact, we can possibly have, another question taken as well. Mahima, one of the things again that was discussed during the course of the discussion today is about capacities. Now, like you mentioned 80 to 100 million doses per month that potentially can be manufactured as and when you get the approval after phase 3. We are a country of 1.3 billion people. I think the entire country is looking at vaccine manufacturers with a great deal of anticipation. How do you see the timelines in terms of rollout, in terms of how our capacities can be expanded, etc., and how quickly can we ramp up to cover, firstly, obviously, the most vulnerable, and then maybe cover all sets of people across the country? How do you see that panning out?
So this really would vary from technology to technology, sir, because some technologies have inherent limitations. So cell culture-based technologies are harder to scale. So for instance, if you're in cell cubes or cell factories, then you need to adopt to fermentation to be able to scale much more rapidly and quicker. So there's one on the drug substance side, what we call the upstream side. And I think on the upstream side, the only way to scale in a time-bound fashion is to collaborate and to look to contract manufacturing capacity and so on and so forth. Because to set up a drug substance facility from scratch is going to take a minimum of 18 months. And I'm being extremely optimistic by saying it's 18 months. So that's not going to happen. So the only way is to look at, who has microbial fermentation facilities, who has cell culture facilities, how quickly can I collaborate? And if you see the AstraZeneca model, that's exactly what they've done. They have a manufacturing site in US, in Europe, and in India. So when we think about it, we need to think, more locally as well as globally to look at how we expand drug substance. In our case, we would be able to deploy other infrastructure or other programs, assuming that it doesn't cause a disruption to routine immunization. We could deploy other infrastructure to do campaigning. But one thing that remains common as an infrastructure that everybody needs is going to be fill-finish capacity. Today, one of the big concerns is, will there be enough glass tubing? Will there be enough vials in which you put the vaccine? We really haven't had this scale of expansion or need for vials ever before. So for even the back-end support manufacturers to be able to supply materials is still going to be a challenge, something that we'll have to see, so, such that they are not allocating to the highest bidder, so to speak, right? But the one infrastructure that's common to all of us is fill-finish infrastructure, because majority of these vaccines, barring a few which are nasal sprays or attempting to be nasal sprays, they're all injectables. And creating that additional fill-finish infrastructure right now will enable us to deliver those 8 billion doses in the most rapid fashion possible, because that will be rate limiting at one point, where the drug substance can be scaled, but you won't be able to fill it in vials. So from a manufacturing perspective, we're trying to do everything we can by looking at 20-dose presentation, 30-dose, having preservatives that, will take us through a much larger vial. But what I've been, trying to advocate for, particularly with DBT and such, including CEPI, is to say create a fund where people can access money to expand their fill-finish infrastructure. And why is this a good thing? There's no downside risk. Even if your vaccine candidate doesn't work, you can ensure that that infrastructure is deployed for whichever vaccine candidate that works. So, it's not a win or lose situation for the government to make a bet on. But these are very critical to be able to rapidly scale. And the third thing, and very important factor, is availability of trained manpower. Right now, we envision creating an additional 500 jobs within the next 6 months. But we really need skilled workforce, and that's a long-term thing as well. But these three things will enable us to rapidly scale.
Thank you, Mahima. In fact, I think it's not a zero-sum game, is what Mahima says from the government perspective. Krishna, before we get to Dr. Swaminathan, who will possibly join us a bit. She's gone? Okay. Before we go to her, I think it looks like she's left us. But equitable distribution. I know you are on the verge of phase 3, possibly end of this month. So since we are looking at you with a great deal of optimism, how do we ensure as a country, 1.3 billion people, we know your abilities to manufacture, we know that there is always a limitation, certain cap on how much you can manufacture. How do we ensure that this equitable distribution just doesn't remain in the paper and, like Mahima said, the highest bidder? Because I've heard you in other webinars where you said, Chinese government came in and blocked the entire South American market on some other vaccine development process. How do we ensure that such a thing does not happen, and how do we ensure Hyderabad, being the vaccine capital of the world, how do we ensure we assert our position? How do we ensure we not only supply for India, we also manufacture and supply to the rest of the world in a very equitable fashion? How do we do that?
I just want to blame the government for that matter, honestly. The reason is the government is looking at it more on a health point of view, COVID problem. But I consider it's an economic point of view. If somebody is starving with the loss of a job and starving, he is going to die. That's much worse. And the WHO and the Indian government, the drug controller, looks at what is 1% adverse reactions and all that. But they're not looking at it. How do we deploy faster? It is possible. Technology now, new technologies, and all the manufacturers, we have all the quality control systems in place. There's nothing that we short circuit anything. But I think government has to sit in the central government and call the manufacturers. Tell me what you want. Each one they're working in compartmental. They say we are fast track, we are fast track. But all put together, no fast track in the country. So literally, it is an isolation. Each one want to look at microscope. How come this Indian company can develop this COVID vaccine? Let me look at it. If it comes from US, no scrutiny, much. But I think that system has to be put now. Our Chief Minister has to put a pressure on the Prime Minister's office. Something the drug controller and DBT, all of them, principal secretary should stick together, call the manufacturers, quick strategy discussion, and how do we execute. There must be one leader there should be executed. If it is done, honestly, I'm telling you, all the 4 manufacturers, 3 from here, Serum, can feed the entire 1.2 billion. Coming to affordability, trust me, I'm telling you, We are lesser than water bottle cost of vaccines. so, water bottle is more
I'm
expensive.
sure the vaccine wouldn't be as much, 330 ml.
So this is 5 times more expensive than your vaccine. So we are really offered. I think we are the lowest in the world. And the best quality. Trust me, I'm telling you. Our quality of a vaccine, Indian manufacturer's quality of vaccine, and GSK and Sanofi is exactly same. Please keep in mind. We follow exactly WHO, TRS, and US FDA guidelines. Nothing less. People think Indian vaccine means something low quality. No, all are same quality. There's only one quality in vaccine field. There's no two quality. So only one quality, be assured of that. And I think, there's some strategic discussion missing. Leadership is missing in Delhi to take on, quickly sit together and put a strategy. Chinese, what they've done, they've given $1 billion to Mexico, blocking the entire Latin American market. They went to Egypt, they're blocking the African market. I really think in 5 years, the Gavi may not exist, UNICEF also may not exist. The way Chinese going and dominating the country's market. It's very scary.
Krishna, in fact, I agree with you on two things here. First thing I think is Government of India really needs to take all stakeholders, including the states and the manufacturers, into confidence, strategize together. Instead of saying just 1 billion doses over a period of so many days or months or so many weeks, we need to strategize on not only on vaccine distribution, but also when we go into that phase where we have to test larger population. I think we need strategies, we need to test all corners of the country, and we need to ensure that the vaccine is made available. Secondly, on Krishna's point, I can vouch for it, because I have been to his lab today on the, biosafety level 3, BSL 3 standard lab. Not just a lab, in fact, the manufacturing facility. I'm told it's one of its kind in the world, not just in India, but it's one of its kind in the world. I am delighted and thrilled, to have witnessed something of that caliber and that standard in Hyderabad. I'm sure other labs are also, labs are of BSL 3 level, but manufacturing at BSL 3 level is also something that is truly unique. So we can certainly compete in terms of quality, in terms of cost, in terms of scale with everybody else in the world. So I also agree with you on the fact that we need to possibly position ourselves, brand ourselves, and talk up in the sense of Government of India and the state governments promoting you and encouraging the local manufacturers. Now, Anand, on this issue of equitable distribution, I've heard Prime Minister Modi talk about how we should possibly start planning now to distribute this vaccine to the large population of our country. What are your thoughts? And then we go to final comments from each of you.
As you rightly said, we need to ponder on this. It's not just developing a vaccine, and then how do we address this 1 billion population who have to be immunized, because from a child to a senior citizen has to be given this vaccine. So in terms of, each company, currently what we do is we have certain manufacturing capacity for existing vaccines. Say we produce various kinds of vaccines for the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. And then what now we are doing is some of those spare capacities is what we are going to use for when this COVID vaccine candidate comes. So we are going to use some of the spare capacities that we have. So the amount of spare capacity that exists in each of the vaccine manufacturer, that is not determined yet. I mean, even if any vaccine, say if Dr. Ella was to develop the Covaxin, and if there's additional capacity required, so far no attempts have been made to even understand how much spare capacities are available with other manufacturers. Now that I heard from Mahima that they're going to produce 80 million doses a month, and they are worried about their inability to fill finish. I'm happy to offer, we have put a brand new fill finish facility just 7-8 kilometers from here, which can fill 200 million doses if it is a 10-dose vial, and if it is a 20-dose vial, it will be much more than that.
You guys need to meet more often, I think.
So some kind of a dialogue among vaccine manufacturers should happen, because it's not about a race as to who comes out with the vaccine first, who makes the most money, or it's not about that. It's how do we address, if you see in terms of the size, today you see the polio vaccine program is supposed to be the biggest, but that's catering to only 27 million. But today you're talking about 1 billion people, and what mechanism is there in case if a candidate comes, how are you going to mass produce, And then how are you also going to distribute across? And if it's going to be a vaccine which has to be stored at -70 or beyond, then really we lack the infrastructure for those kind of things. So I think some high-level planning at the center has to happen to ensure speedy development, also adequate distribution across the country.